Hi, everyone. Welcome to Wine.com Experiences. I'm Gwendolyn Osborn. Today we are visiting Australia, specifically to taste the quality and diversity of Shiraz there. Of course, we will also be talking to 3 winemakers and producers behind those wines. If you purchase the wines ahead of time from Wine.com, fantastic. Please go ahead, get those open, pour them into glassware if you can. It's 3 wines, and these are really big wines. They are top rated, incredibly delicious wines. And I realize that might seem like a lot, but these are also the kinds of wines that will last for several days, so you can enjoy them over the weekend. So I highly encourage you to open them all 3 at once. They're great to taste side by side. That said, you can always come back, revisit this video on our Wine.com YouTube channel. So the 3 wines we are tasting in order are the Penfolds Kalimna Bin 28 Shiraz, the John Duval Entity Shiraz, and Yalumba, the signature Barossa Cabernet Shiraz. I'm really excited about tasting these wines because I think they're just such great examples of longevity and excellence of Australian wine, especially Shiraz. And that's really shown and kind of represented in the people behind the wines, who 3 of those we are speaking with today, top rated wines from some of the best producers in Australia. Shiraz, it's the signature grape of Australia, and Barossa is the signature region for Shiraz, and all of these wines are coming from that region. So it's going to be a lot of fun to taste through the spectrum, I guess, of excellent Shiraz in Barossa Valley. So now let's introduce our guests. Representing Penfolds, we have senior winemaker Stephanie Dutton. From John Duval, we have proprietor and winemaker John Duval and winemaker Tim Duval. And of course, from Yalumba, we have the 6th generation estate proprietor and senior brand manager, Jessica Hill-Smith. Welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here.
Yeah, so glad to have you. So excited to be tasting delicious Shiraz wine. I think I mentioned that earlier to you. So before we get started, one thing I wanted to kind of touch on was you've all been in the industry for quite some time, either because of your family or your history or the property you're with. So you've kind of seen this evolution of Shiraz in Australia. I wonder if what do you think makes Shiraz so magical in Australia? And Stephanie, we'll start with you on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I love the fact that this has been the great variety that has taken the Australian wine industry story to the rest of the world on a global stage. It's certainly worthy of having that position, I guess. And I think as you move around the country, as you move around the state of South Australia that we're in, and even the region of the Barossa, you see incredible diversity by way of soils, climates, sites. And the great news for the Australian story is that Shiraz seems to thrive in so many of them. There's a versatility there, and there's a reliability.
That is, I love that, versatility and reliability. That's a great sum up of that. John and Tim, what about you?
Well, I guess really we're talking about an area with very old soils, Mediterranean climate, and it's very suited to the expression of Shiraz. We really look at the Barossa as 2 regions, the Barossa Valley and Eden Valley, and they're really different expressions. So you got the opportunity to really sort of focus on either or blend the 2 regions.
And I guess we're also fortunate to have some of the oldest Shiraz vines in the world in the Barossa as well. So there's a wealth of viticultural information there, and also a great legacy for us to work with now.
Yeah, it is. The old vines there are just absolutely impressive and magical and remarkable. Jessica, what are your thoughts on that?
It's been summed up very well, but I think one thing that I'm always so grateful for is whenever I travel around the world, the Barossa is famous for something. And when I tell people I'm from the town of Anguston, or I might say Adelaide, I'm met with pretty blank faces. But when I say the Barossa, people go, I know the Barossa, I know Shiraz. So I think we're really, really lucky that we make a wine that is famous around the world in our region.
Yeah, and it is consistently not improving, but like evolving into just, again, like I was saying, the longevity of the quality of Shiraz in Australia. I mean, that's thanks to you and many others in your field who have made sure that that will happen, so that some of the best wines of the world our Shiraz and Barossa Valley. So speaking of which, I would like to get started tasting. So we are going to start with the Penfolds. Stephanie, starting with you. Penfolds, very long history, one of the oldest. And I love the tagline, which I discovered of reading about Penfolds for this, which was from a soil that had never made grapes from winemakers who had never made wine. So I love just people going in totally clueless and just like, let's do it. Obviously, they figured it out. But tell us a little bit about the beginning of the winery and how it evolved a bit.
Yeah, I love that you've started that story right at the very beginning, because so often when we start talking about Penfolds, you know, we go, or we jump straight to the 1950s, which is a really important decade for us. And in my mind, it sort of marks the start of our modern winemaking era. But we often completely forget to make mention of sort of the 100+ years of history that came before that, which really, I guess, built the Penfolds name in particularly the colony of Adelaide, which was founded in 1836. But also, you know, around Australia, that took that name and that took Penfolds wines around the entire country and eventually to a global stage. But it's a long history, and things did change around about the 1950s when table wine was really starting to gain popularity in this country. And I guess that story of Shiraz really started to gather a lot of momentum around that time.
Yeah, because I don't think many people know that Australia started as a fortified wine producing.
Absolutely.
Continent. I was going to say country, but yeah, country and continent. Yeah, it's all fortified wine. And it was that time that all of a sudden that started evolving.
Exactly. And that part of our history is really important at Penfolds, because our fortified winemaking roots really, I guess, set a philosophy and introduced this craft of blending to the Penfolds winemaking team, which would then ensure for decades to follow. And that notion of blending, that craft, I think that's really hard to learn via textbooks. It's something that you learn via long apprenticeships, on the job training, is something that has been ever enduring in the Penfolds team. In saying that, I always remind people, knowing when not to blend is just as important as knowing when to blend.
Okay, so that leads me into my question about the bin series, because we were tasting bin 28, but you have several bins. And so how did that kind of concept come about? What does it mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad that we're talking about bin 28 today, because bin 28 we sort of refer to as one of the earliest bins in our history books. And I think about that statement, and if you go back to the very early days, you know, the birth of Grange in 1951, I guess that was essentially our first bin that is still, you know, with us to this day. But bin 28 dates back to the late 1950s. It's a wine that now has a lot of pedigree and a lot of history under its belt. But that bin title has become very famous for Penfolds and in the Australian wine scene. And when I'm asked what it stands for, I almost feel like I'm letting people down. It's very unromantic, batch identification number, yet at the same time, it's incredibly logical. And I think that the people find it satisfying knowing that it stands for you know, something that was a working title at the time. Yeah. A reference to our bins or our batches here, of course, at McGill Estate.
I think, yeah, they feel like maybe it's like super vintage, you know, it's like that was the batch back in the 1950s. It's very cool. And what about, so in this kind of wine, how are you working with the Shiraz vineyards? What kind are you looking for? Like age of the vineyards, the type of soil you're looking for in crafting this wine? Yeah,
absolutely. I think when you look particularly to the Barossa Valley, which is where this wine really very much started, a generous Shiraz that had mid-palate fleshiness. It often has a creaminess in terms of its texture, and even palate weight from start, middle, and to end. We're often looking at vineyards that offer the hallmarks of what Australian Shiraz is known for around the globe, and that is berry-driven characteristics, whether it's blackberry, blackcurrant. You've got the, you know, dark cherry, raspberry. It's fruit generosity. And I think that that's really important depending on the vineyards that we're tapping into. And of course, the Kalimna vineyard is a really important part of this wine's history and heritage. It's where the style was set. It's where the story began. And knowing what Kalimna is famous for, which is that generosity, it is that evenness, that plushness, that coffee character that comes through. It's really important.
Yes. Okay, that makes me really want to taste the wine. So that's what we're going to do. So give us kind of just some of your, the thoughts of like what's jumping out of the glass for you, and we'll get into tasting and talk about the structure and the aromatics and the profile and all that good tasting profile stuff.
Absolutely. Bin 28, I often say to people, is this lovely intersection of both where Shiraz and Penfolds house style come together, and they overlap in the best possible way. And when I talk about house style and what I see in the glass for Bin 28, I often will, and as is the case today, talk to this lovely generous licorice characteristic. It's tapping into dark fruited flavor profile. So, for me, calling out that quince and that blackberry is very much a hallmark of this wine, regardless of what vintage we're talking about. And I do see almost like this milk chocolate creaminess. And I see that by way of character and by way of texture. And that taps back into the evenness that I spoke about on the palate, which is a hallmark of Bin 28.
That is beautiful. And I get that when you said that chocolate and licorice, and I mean, that's just what's now standing out. But I love it, but it has like a zing to it also, almost like the fresh berry kind of right off the vine kind of.
Absolutely. We often talk about energy attached to Bin 28. And that energy, I guess, is that vibrancy, that life that you were talking about. And I think that that's really important to be able to go for density and saturation, but at the same time have the life and energy attached to the wine is really what the end game is about.
That's right. And this is absolutely delicious right now. But if somebody were asking, how long could I hang on to this? How will it evolve? What advice would you give?
I tend to be so conservative in this space, and I'll often say to people, 15 years is very much safe territory, and then it's not unusual for us to be looking at this wine 30 years later and it's still proving itself. But I far prefer you drink a wine too young than too old, and so 15 to 20 years is often a bit of a guide that I end up giving.
That's fantastic. That's good to know. Because it's so good right now. And then food. I mean, what kind of food pairings would you recommend, or just what would you enjoy eating with those?
Again, you've probably got a bit of versatility here. We talk about the softness in terms of the tannin profile associated with Bin 28, which does make it a little bit of an all-rounder and a crowd pleaser. Yeah. One of the best matches I've had with Bin 28 has been pork belly, and done a few different ways. But pork belly, I guess, has that generosity of flavor. But at the same time, there's nothing too robust or charred about the way that you often cook pork belly. And there's a dish that our chef here does at Penfolds, which is pork belly with cauliflower and macadamia. And that to me has been the ultimate match. But pork in so many different variations at home.
I was going to say, for those of us who have never cooked pork belly, I mean, I feel like I would like to, but it's intimidating. Maybe a pork tenderloin would be lovely.
Correct. And cured meats as well is the other option.
Yeah, although it's just perfectly lovely on its own too. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Delicious. Okay. Next, we are moving on to Duval's. John and Tim Duval. Hello.
Hi.
So John, you matriculated at Penfolds, if you will, but also came from kind of generations of winemaking in your family. Tell us a little about, what that time at Penfolds taught you and your history there.
Well, I'm obviously very fortunate to have worked for Penfolds for 29 years and 16 years as chief winemaker. But it was meant to be. I worked for Penfolds in many respects because my family had a farm south of Adelaide, and coincidentally, as well as having a world famous Suffolk sheep stud, grew Shiraz and Grant, and used to sell the Shiraz to Penfolds. And as it turned out, Penfolds liked our Shiraz so much that they took cuttings from our vineyard to replant some of McGill. And as Steph has just said, that's the founding place where Dr. Penfolds started Penfolds. So great to have that history, probably more vignerons than winemaking. And I guess we're in sort of fourth generation of vignerons and the second generation of winemaking.
Yeah, and then so obviously that kind of history led you, that connection led you there. But 2003, you decided to venture out to do your own label. What, I guess, was and is the mission of Shiraz and Barossa at John Duval Wines?
Well,
it doesn't have to just be Shiraz; it can be anything. But yeah. the mission.
Very fortunate with that 29 years with Penfolds. I guess I had a pretty good idea where the better Shiraz country was. I'm very fortunate to have connections in the grower community. So I knew where the great vineyards were, and fortunate enough to join the club, so to speak, to get access to some of the very old vineyards, some over 100 years old, which was very much part of what we're looking for. The other thing, and I think I touched briefly on it before, is that we really do focus on the two valleys in the Barossa Valley and Eden Valley, and Entity in particular highlights the more aromatic expression of Shiraz we get from Eden Valley, with a little bit more structure we get from the Barossa Valley, and the two valleys just blend beautifully together.
Yeah, I was going to mention that to those, I guess, at home who have the set, to notice that the two wines at the beginning and end have Barossa Valley, but the Entity only has Barossa. And as you mentioned earlier, I think that's an important distinction that I learned way down the line in my education, was that Barossa includes Barossa Valley and Eden Valley. So two different places with two, like you said, very different styles. The Eden Valley is higher elevation, yes?
That's right. It's higher, it's cooler, and in some cases 2 to 3 weeks later ripening compared to the Barossa Valley.
Yeah, so blending those makes a big difference. Tim, you had some time at a different career in law, but clearly the next step after that is coming back to make wine with your dad. What drew you back to the property?
Well, I guess I was pretty fortunate growing up in the Barossa and I guess around a wine family and in and amongst vineyards and running around the Penfolds winery from time to time. But I guess it was an opportunity for me to go out and get some experience outside the family business and to, I guess, advance myself and my palate, doing some vintages outside the winery, working in retail for a while, and then working, I guess, in the commercial side of the industry as well through some legal practice. But I was really too good an opportunity to miss to come back and work with Dad. He's, I think, coming up to vintage 49 in the Barossa in 22. So unlocking all that knowledge and generational history that's been passed down was just such an opportunity. And I had a passion for, I guess, the family business, but also for the Barossa that I really wanted to complete and go back and work side by side with Dad.
Yeah.
And I guess when Tim was studying, he worked a little bit part-time in the business. So we tested each other. We didn't come to blows. So we worked out we could work together. So it's been fantastic to have Tim on board.
Good. I'm glad that worked out well. But I bet it's just fantastic to soak up so much experience and history and knowledge from someone who knows so much. So, well, I want to taste the wine. I want to talk a little bit about when we're tasting it. Tell us a little bit on the aromas and the flavor profile. Kind of give us a little bit of input on kind of what's coming from Eden versus Barossa and the old vine character, just kind of what we're getting in the wine and how it, I guess, relates back to what we've discussed.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll start off. I think one of our philosophies, and I've probably picked up in my days at Penfolds as well, is maximising blending options. So we spend a lot of time in vineyards pre-harvest, just working out if there's any batches that we like a little bit more, keep those batches separate. And Eden Valley really does have that lovely sort of blue fruit aromatics to it, lovely vibrant acidity, and maybe slightly finer tannins compared to the Barossa Valley, which is a little bit more darker fruit and structural, and the two blend beautifully together. And how do you see that in the wine, Tim?
Well, I think you can see it pretty clearly in the wine. I guess the workhorse of the wine is that Barossa Valley, which is giving it, I guess, the structure, the depth of fruit flavour, and I guess, as John alluded to, a bit more of that kind of darker fruit profile. And then we're seeing the influence of Eden Valley in some kind of those blue fruit highlights, a little bit of lift in aromatics, and that lovely line of acidity, which I think really cleans up the palate and gives it some elegance and refinement, which is one of the things I guess we're really aspiring to in our style, is to be an elegant expression of old vineyards. And I think that's one of the things that we can do really well in the Barossa, when we balance out that, Barossa Valley richness and intensity with that kind of elegance and finesse and aromatic highlights from Eden Valley. And certainly that's one of the hallmarks of, I guess, the entity style is getting the best out of those two regions to create a whole wine.
The other thing perhaps I should note as well is it's for all of the John de Val wines reds, we focus on using fine grain French oak. So that's something that I think is an important part of the style as well. Yeah. Although we're probably only talking about 1/3 new French oak barrels for entity compared to some of our other wines.
Okay, yeah, I kind of, once you say that. Also, I mean, I saw those pictures earlier of the really old vines. We're talking about the age of the vines. What is either the average or the oldest age of the vines that go into this wine?
Yeah, sure. So I guess because it is a bit of a blend across the region, there is a diversity of vine age. Some of the younger vineyards in here are maybe 30 to 35 years old. So just, I guess, tipping into what we'd call old vines. Mm-hmm. And then we've got material that's over centenarian vine age. So over 100-year-old material, particularly the old vines from the northern end of the Barossa Valley, a kind of a little sub area called Ebenezer. We've got, we're very fortunate to have access to some 6th generation family growers in that portion of Barossa Valley. And obviously that adds some intensity and richness and structure to that blend, and it does a lot of heavy lifting for that Barossa Valley component.
Yeah, it's just beautiful. I love that balance of fruit. It's almost like the Eden Valley, maybe it's Eden Valley. When you're talking about that lift of aromatics, it's almost like that almost a floral note that's kind of bringing up some of that fruit that kind of stood out to me. And then the structure is so pretty. And obviously it's quite delicious right now. I could drink it all. But if you're thinking about kind of this kind of wine as it evolves over time, what would you advise people, and what would they expect 5, 10, 15 years down the road for the wine to taste like?
I guess a lot of the time it comes back to how the consumer really enjoys their wine. Do they enjoy it really young and primary and that kind of deliciousness that you have as a younger wine as it is now? But with more time, obviously the tannins soften down, you probably get a little bit more savouriness. And I guess we'd encourage people to, if they get a 6-pack, for instance, they can really see the evolution of the wine when it does soften down. I think, as Steph said before, these wines, we're probably a bit conservative in giving an estimate of how long it can live, but I see this wine being easily a 15 to 20-year-old wine. Yeah. And maybe that kind of peak window where we'd like to see that kind of lovely softness starting to come in about the 10-year range.
Yeah, and I think that your advice is so sound. I've heard this many times, and I give it to other people, of if you want to put a wine down, don't buy just one if you can afford it. But buy 3 to 6, even a case if you can, and drink one every year, a couple of years, and when you're like, oh, this is the best ever.
Yeah, and it's so fun to track that evolution and to see where you like the wine the best, and I guess that helps to find your preferences to how you sell a wine.
Yeah, you can't tell somebody exactly when to drink something because it does depend on their preference. So you founded this winery in 2003. John, when was the first vintage? 2004? 2004
was the first, yeah.
And how is that tasting right now?
Well, it's probably, I think, fully mature and a really nice drinking phase at the moment. The tannins are softened, nice savouriness, texturally, really good food wine. So a nice place.
Perfect. All right. Well, we're going to have to put some of these down. And food for this, because it's got that floral, it's got that blueberry, it's got all this kind of elegant fruit flavors, but it's also very just intensity. So what would you recommend to people to eat with it?
Yeah, I guess there is a few options as well, because we've got that little bit of restraint in the wine and some elegance, that it does have some versatility. So I guess in the pork spectrum, things like barbecue pork, perhaps it's got a little bit of richness to it, and this will help cut through with that nice cleansing acidity from the Eden Valley component. Or we can move to something that's more of a slow braised beef, or something that's a slow cook that has the intensity to match up with the wine. But you can have a bit of fun experimenting too.
Yeah. John, have you ever had just one meal that you'd like to have with your entity, or just?
Well, I'm a bit of a lamb fan, to be honest. So a nice lamb shank, or sort of just the flavours of lamb tend to marry very well with the Shiraz character.
Got it. Yeah, these are, it's beautiful wine. So thank you so much, both of you. It's delicious. Okay, so our next wine, we are moving to Yalumba. Yolanda with Jessica. So Jessica, you are 6th generation proprietor of Yolanda. So you're one of the oldest family owned and run wine properties in Australia. Can you tell us a little bit about the beginnings of Yolanda and how your family's kind of evolved from then to now? Just sum up 150 something years in 2 minutes.
Well, this week, actually, we celebrated our 172nd birthday. So our birthday on the 17th of November. Back on the 17th of November, 1849, our founder, my great-great-great-grandfather, Samuel Smith, planted our first vines in the ground. So that marked the beginnings of our family history, right in the very same spot where we're making wine to this day. So we're in Eden Valley in the small town of Anguston, and that clock tower image that you just saw is our home. And that's where we have been for 6 generations making wine. But we do talk about being the oldest family-owned winery in Australia, because I believe we believe that we are. We're the first established. There's lots and lots of old multi-generational wine families across Australia, but we're very proudly so. So you'll often hear all the family winemakers talk about their family history and heritage, because we're so lucky that over the 6 generations, there wasn't any generation of our family that wanted to give it up. There was something that kept everyone really connected to the place where we started. Samuel Smith was an Englishman, so he came over from Dorset back in the mid 1800s in search of a new life, and he got very, very lucky finding a small nugget of gold. I think it was worth £300, and that afforded him the luxury to buy a vineyard or buy a plot of land and a horse, where he set about planting the first Yolanda vineyards. And I think, interestingly, decided to call our family farm Yolanda, which is an Aboriginal word for all the country around. So unlike lots of our neighbours around us who named their family farm or their winery after their family name, or a name of a place that reminded them of home back in England, we did seek for something different, and I'm so glad that we do now.
Yeah. So, and also, we saw that picture. I just want to touch on the picture we just saw, because I've actually had the privilege of visiting Yolanda and your cooperage. So a cooperage, which is where they make oak barrels for wine. Yolanda, you have your own cooperage there. He looks very hard at work. Yeah, there's no joke making a barrel. I've been to 2 cooperages before, and I'm like, what? So it's very interesting that you have that at your property, which is kind of a unique thing.
Absolutely. And that's not a staged photo. That's exactly what it looks like when our coopers are making barrels. It's really hard work. They have to be very strong, and they have lost tips of their fingers because it's hard labor, it's hard work. And that art of making a barrel from scratch by hand, you really can't see many places anymore. And we're the only country in the Southern Hemisphere that still makes our own barrels on site. And I think probably a handful of wineries around the world still do. They have a cooperage on site with master coopers making the barrels that they need for their wines. Our coopers make about 30% of the barrels we need, and those barrels are really reserved for our top wines like Signature.
Yeah. And Octavia, right?
And Octavia's, yes.
Yeah. Let's talk about Yolanda's just Shiraz vineyards in the Barossa. So kind of what is, I guess, Yolanda's philosophy with Shiraz, and what kind of soils you're looking for and the age of the vines?
Mm-hmm. Well, for different wines, we're looking for different things. For a wine like the Signature, which is obviously a blend of Cabernet and Shiraz, we're looking for special vineyards across the Barossa. So we generally work with probably parcels or growers, about 10 to 12 different growers that we work on specific, or sourcing specific plots from their vineyard. And we're really looking for, Cabernet that is structured and generous and concentrated, but really has that the aromatic lift and that palate structure. And then the Shiraz, we're really looking for that warmth and generosity and richness to balance the Cabernet in that blend. But for different Shiraz wines in our collection, we make single vineyard Shiraz from really old vines. The oldest vineyard is 1919, which we make for our steeple Shiraz. And then for the Octavius, which you've tried, the oldest parcel in that blend of 4 vineyards is 1854. So that's one of the oldest Shiraz vineyards planted in Eden Valley. Wow. So you know, all of us have talked about old vines and how, you know, privileged we feel to be able to work with these old vine treasures. And, you know, every tasting I've ever done, people are so interested in what it means to, you know, what is an old vine and why is it different from anything else? Yeah. And, you know, essentially an old vine has just been a young vine that was planted in the perfect spot. So it's continued to make produce fantastic grapes and make fantastic wine since it was planted there. So it's really a story of terroir and suiting the variety to the place.
Yeah. And then as that vine gets older, it's less grapes, there's more intensity, there's more complexity. So both Stephanie and Tim and John mentioned about blending. I think that's so interesting is you can be blending Shiraz, which in other places might not mean much, but if you're blending different ages of the vines and the different terroirs where they've grown so deep, it really makes a difference, which is just kind of a whole different kind of blending.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the signature, let's talk a little bit about the signature. I love this wine. There's a story behind the signature. So the blend is Cabernet and Shiraz. Does the percentage change each year?
It varies slightly. It generally will tend to be slightly dominant in Cabernet, but for all intents and purposes, it's really a 50-50 split. You know, a couple of percentages either side, but it's really the blend is about finding that perfect balance of Cabernet and Shiraz and making sure the wine tastes like a Cabernet Shiraz, not a Cabernet dominant with Shiraz or vice versa. So it's really about finding the marriage between the two amazing varieties and creating the signature blend.
Good. And then tell us the story behind the signature.
Well, the signature story, I think, is what makes this wine so special. It's definitely the reason why so many people within our winery and our business connect with it. The story of the signature started back in 1962. So my grandfather, Wyndham, decided to relaunch, as people do. You change a label and you want to market something differently. And we had an old wine called Yalumba Galway Claret. And our Prime Minister of the time, Sir Robert Menzies, declared at an Easter show that Yalumba had made the greatest red wine he had ever tasted. And so my grandpa wasn't one to let that fall on deaf ears. And so he decided to relabel that wine and call it our signature. If our Prime Minister thinks it's the best wine out there, well, this is going to be our signature wine. And so we labeled it the signature, but he also decided to, and I don't know why he did, but he decided to dedicate that vintage to our founder, Samuel Smith. And that really kicked off a tradition that every single vintage we release, we dedicate it to somebody else in our business. They're someone that embodies the culture and traditions of who we are as a family. And it can be anybody. It's been so many different people over the many, many vintages. We've had, I think, 56, 57 signatories over 47 vintages. So some years there are 2 names that will have their signature on the bottle, but their signature is on the front label of the bottle, like you can see in the bottle of signature you have. And if you turn over the back label, it will tell a story about the life and times of the colourful characters that have become signatories over the years. And all of these people, we talk about being a family business a lot, and we're very proudly so, but, you know, the signatories that have had their name on the bottle and the story of their time at Yalumba and their family and their life also tell the story of the people that have helped us stay family, helped us get to where we are today. So the signature is a celebration of the people of Yalumba, and it's one of those most treasured traditions that we hold very sacred to everyone at Yalumba.
It's one big family. That's what it is.
One big family, absolutely.
So talk us through this taste profile. You've got Cabernet and Shiraz. They complement each other. Kind of tell us what's going on in the aromas and flavor profiles we taste.
Yeah, the classic blend, or the Great Australian Red, it's been nicknamed, this blend of Cabernet and Shiraz. And I guess that's because while you can find Cabernet Shiraz blends outside of Australia, no one champions it as much as we do here. So it's a quintessentially Aussie blend. And I love that about the blend of Cabernet Shiraz, because so often we're tasting wines that are being compared alongside their Northern Hemisphere counterpart, and you reference those old world styles when you're talking about Australian wines using the same varieties. But for Cab Shiraz, it's undeniably Australian. So we love the blend for that reason, but we also love the blend because of the amazing wines that they produce. And you'll often hear people talk about, Cabernet really provides that the spine and skeleton, that elegant framework in the blend, and that, I guess, the structure and length. And then the Shiraz is the warmth, it's the generosity, the richness, and together they really meld so well together to create this beautiful blend of Cabernet and Shiraz.
Yeah, I had mesh, but I think meld is much better.
Mesh.
Or complement each other, right?
Mesh.
Same thing. So yeah, it's a beautiful wine. We have a couple of some older vintages of all of these wines, but yeah, it's so wonderful to see kind of how they age over time. So for your signature, do you have recommended aging times for this, or?
Yeah, much like Steph and Tim and John have said,
they're conservative.
The guidelines conservative at 15 years. I think that's what we've put on the back label. But we can very confidently say that these wines do last a lot longer. My dad, Robert, celebrated a significant birthday last week, and so we brought out some special old bottles from the cellar, and the oldest signature we had on the table was 1966, so it wasn't quite his birth year, a little bit younger, but it was about 55 years of age, and they're just such exciting ethereal wines to look at when they're that old. So they do look beautiful and interesting, but I love sort of capturing the wines when they still have some primary fruit characters. So I think that 10 to 12-year-old mark is when I think they're looking that balance between showing some age, but also still holding on to that freshness.
Got it. And food, do you have we had some pork belly, we had some lamb.
Everyone was making me hungry.
I know, right? Me too.
Absolutely love lamb. I would always pair signature with lamb, because it's not as overbearing, and the signature, while it's still quite a rich, concentrated wine, there's a beautiful softness and elegance about it. So it's not a blockbuster red that needs lots and lots of rich flavors to pair it with. I think you can use I like a simple lamb roast is perfectly fine. And that's what I would tend to eat, lamb or a lamb ragu with pappardelle or something like that. A Wagyu burger we've had. There's a restaurant in the Barossa that does amazing burgers. And I think a glass of signature with a really good beef burger would be my perfect match today. That's what I'm in the mood for.
Perfect. Well, I have one, delicious. Thank you so much. I have one little last follow-up question, just for people who might want to travel when we can to Australia. Do each of you have a cellar door open and ready for visitors, Jessica? I know I've been there, so I know you do.
We do. We all do, actually, but we do have a cellar door that is open 7 days, and we would love to be able to welcome international guests.
And you were in the Eden Valley, right?
Yes, in Eden Valley. So the town is Anguston, but we're in the Eden Valley region in the Barossa. But it's a beautiful spot, and you can go and see the cooperage. You can taste all the wines and wander around our cellars there.
Excellent. John and Tim, John Duval.
We've got a cool cellar door. It's actually a small collective called Artisans of Barossa.
Ooh.
So 8 winemakers under one roof, so you can try through over 100 wines, sit down to a flight of Shiraz from all the different sub-regions across Barossa. So we've just opened that new cellar door from the 1st of October. So we're really looking forward to welcoming our American friends and international visitors as soon as we can.
That's fantastic.
Tim,
One-stop.
I heard a rumour, Tim, that you are making pretty great Reuben sandwiches there.
Yeah, we're doing a good Reuben. Hopefully, we're saying it's Baross's best, but I think we might just have to line up a few taste test.
I'm going to come down for a Reuben.
There you go. Stephanie, I know.
Yeah, absolutely. We are lucky. We have two brand homes here in South Australia. They're separated by about an hour in terms of travel time. But where I'm sitting at the moment is McGill Estate. And this is quite rare in the sense that it's a fully operational winery, but really not that far away from Adelaide's central business district. You know, it's in the middle of suburbia and it looks a little bit out of place, but I remind people that we were here first. And of course, then the Barossa Valley, which is about an hour away. And so there's a great opportunity to taste through both cellar doors.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I encourage everyone who's watching to visit Australia when you can. Go. It's beautiful. I've been there. I named one of my children Adelaide. I mean, it is gorgeous, wonderful. The people are amazing and nice. And just it's a just joyful place to be. So I want to thank you all so much for being here and sharing your wines, your stories, your histories. These were delicious. I'm going to try to help them last a few days if I can. But if you don't have the wines, we have them still available on Wine.com. We have a treasure trove of delicious Australian wines, a lot of Shiraz that you can kind of dive into and discover. While I was planning for this webinar, I actually ended up buying a case myself just because I got so thirsty. But obviously I'm a big fan. I encourage you all to kind of introduce yourself or reintroduce yourself to Australia, especially Australian Shiraz. Again, Stephanie, John, Tim, and Jessica, thank you so much for being here. We look forward to visiting again when we can.
Thanks, Gwendolyn.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
It's both a science and a form of high art. It's made from the combination of grapes, sunlight, rain, soil, and time. It's raised up in the moments that matter. It's wine. And we are Wine.com. We have the largest wine selection in the world, online sommeliers with free advice, and now our powerful new app puts the entire world of wine in your hands. Wine.com. Seriously passionate about wine. Download our free app today.